everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this webinar with Fullscript and Vital Nutrients. My name is Kaylee. I'm part of the marketing team here at Fullscript, and we're very excited to have Dr. John Troup here today with Vital Nutrients to talk about the latest research on stress and sleep and how it relates to adrenal dysfunction, among other things, I know. Before we get into the presentation though, I just want to let everyone know that this is being recorded, and everyone, whether they attended or not, will get access to the recording and any additional resources we have through their email. But you can also find all past and upcoming webinars at fullscript.com/webinars, so you'll be able to find it there. And throughout the webinar, if you have any questions for Dr. Troup, you can put them in your questions section on your dashboard, and we will hopefully have time for a live Q&A towards the end of the presentation. So again, I'd like to thank Dr. Troup and Vital Nutrients for being here with us today. Dr. Troup serves as the Chief Science and Education Officer for Vital Nutrients, where he provides key insight on the innovation, selection, and use of Vital Nutrients products, as well as helps to advance educational insights to help practitioners and consumers select products to support healthy lifestyles. And prior to joining Vital Nutrients, Dr. Troup served as a member of the senior management team at several Fortune 50 consumer nutrition health businesses, including Pfizer, Novartis, Nestle, Wyeth, and Unilever. He also led teams at several dietary supplement companies, including Metagenics and Standard Process. Dr. Troup is a married father of 2 grown daughters, and outside of work, he enjoys travel, cooking, and fitness activities. And I'm sure we could go on and on, but I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Troup, and you can take the presentation away, and I will pop back in for a Q&A towards the end.
Great, thanks Kaylee, and thanks everybody for joining us. I've been looking forward to this presentation for quite some time. Stress and sleep have oftentimes been considered, primary issues that you'll see in the clinic, but actually in reality, and what I hope that will be clear during the course of this presentation, is that stress and sleep are really the result of a combination of issues facing people every day, and that when you think about trying to address the issue of stress and sleep, it should be with an approach of addressing underlying systems of care. And so that's really what I'm looking forward to sharing with you today, and some of that insight. During the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to go through 3 general areas. First, I want to share with you the background to why the problem of sleep deprivation and the problem of increasing stress is such a big problem, and what the incidence and prevalence of that is, and what effect it has on our overall health. The second part of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the basic mechanisms and the underlying systems that we need to address. And we'll talk not only about adrenal function, but we're going to talk about the HPA axis and all the systems that need to be managed at one time for the best possible patient outcome. And then the third area we'll summarize, and we'll talk about clinical protocols and clinical guidelines, and then answer some questions at the end. So what's happening in America? We know that chronic diseases are at an all-time high. Even the USDA came out at the beginning of this year and shared interesting statistics with chronic diseases. And a lot of it is based off of a couple of critical issues that we now can appreciate more than ever before. Number one are nutrient gaps and nutrient deficiencies because of poor diet practices and habits. And secondly, the contribution that stress and poor sleep habits has on the progression and complications of chronic diseases is really a growing issue. And that's why it's so important that we talk about this today. So it's interesting, in the time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, people generally started becoming more and more aware of their own management of their health status. And what happened is that many people and new people came into a greater awareness of dietary supplements and nutritional support. And their first interest in coming into the category was to be able to prevent catching the virus. But what happened since that time, while they were doing that, they experienced lifestyle problems and issues that actually became a catch-22 and led to further complications of chronic diseases and underlying problems, because they really weren't fully aware of how to manage these lifestyle issues. and stress and sleep were highest among them. We now know too that when people experience stress, over 80% of people who report increased stress have moderate to serious complications of the level of stress that they have. So it's a major problem that leads to complications in health status. If you look at how the different generations report how they feel about stress, mood, and the lack of sleep, basically every generation reports a problem with stress, altered mood, and many of them report complications of sleep or sleep disorders. We know that stress and altered mood states are the highest issues across the board, with reporting in any generation anywhere from 40% or higher reporting complications with that. The big question is not so much what can I do about minimizing stress or improving my sleep, but what effect does it have on the underlying systems of my body that cause complications, and what's the driving force that leads to an inability to manage stress or to get better sleep. And that's why adrenal function is so important, because it's the core of the underlying systems that's responsible to tie it all together, that affects or can help address the management of stress as well as improving sleep. Sleep deprivation is a national problem. This map presented by the CDC several months ago shows areas of the country where highest percent of the population are having sleep deprivation. So we know that the incidence and prevalence of poor sleep is quite high, and we also know that there's a very high correlation between sleep deprivation, higher levels of stress, and increasing rates of chronic disease. So what is the deal with stress? Stress is really kind of a normal response, actually, if you think about it. And this slide really presents the concept of what should happen. You know, you feel okay if you're in a stress-free situation, your performance, your sleep, your ability to manage response to stress is quite manageable. But with increasing stress, all of that becomes harder. And not only from a mental state, but even more so from a physiological state, where all of a sudden the body is unable to manage and cycle through or be resilient. And so when that happens and increased stress is around for longer periods of time, or defined as chronic stress, is quite high, the fundamental problem is that the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, is starting to become dysfunctional. And what do we mean by dysfunctional? Dysfunctional means that that system is unable to be resilient or cycle itself so that cortisol levels will decrease and basically be prepared for a next bout. And that's fundamentally, when we talk about adrenal dysfunction, that's what's happening. It's a complicated network of systems, though, and that by managing only one part of the system will be an incomplete approach to patient care. And that's really the focus of this presentation today. So here's the summary of what is at the core of the stress response. It's the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal at its core, but it's connected to major systems of the body, like the digestive tract. We'll talk more about that. And even more importantly, it's connected to metabolic processes, which are controlled actually by the endocannabinoid system in our bodies. And so if you look at any one of those systems as trying to manage it, the ability to completely resolve stress or to improve sleep will be incomplete. It won't be as optimal as possible. And so understanding how these three systems actually work together for a better and more resilient process to stress can improve sleep, can be a more effective therapeutic regimen for your patients. So at the outset, I really want to emphasize this concept is that this is not about a symptomatic approach to managing adrenal dysfunction. What stress and sleep is really all about is understanding the most important underlying systems that complicate the ability to manage stress or to improve sleep. And the most important integrated systems to consider when somebody is complaining about these two general symptomatic views is the HP axis and adrenal function is number one. making sure that nutrient deficiencies and the gaps can be filled, addressing the immune and the inflammatory response, the endocannabinoid system, making sure that the digestive system in the gut is balanced and controlled. And by addressing those systems, stress and emotional well-being can be improved and the sleep response can be consistently better. And so it's a systematic approach to understanding what the general issue is and being able to manage it more effectively. So let's talk about this in the concept and the context of resiliency and the need to balance and optimize the stress response. The stress response is not just about feeling anxious or an increase in cortisol. We should be considering how to manage stress as the stress response results in a number of complications in major systems of the body. Most important, which are disruption of the circadian rhythm, what to do with the ability to control your mood or anxiousness or the stress response. What about metabolic processes and the glycemic response? And then the inability to appropriately resolve the inflammatory response or as a result of having a poor responding immune system. So we need to think about, it's not just stress and reducing cortisol, it's managing all the negative things that cortisol itself has done across all these systems that contribute to complications. Now, a deficiency or a complication in any one of these systems can also lead to stress, but typically the way it really happens is increased stress then results in a domino effect that compromises each one of these systems. And so if we can manage stress, we can avoid the acceleration and the progression to chronic health problems. We can improve sleep. And as a result of that, we can stabilize our health systems, and then the stress response and feelings of well-being can be improved. So why is this important? I've mentioned now a couple of times this progression into complications, and we now know that there's really good epidemiological data that shows that chronic stress levels and chronic poor sleep experiences result in increased risk of developing heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and complications in mood states leading to depression and anxiety that can be complicated and uncontrolled. So when a patient presents and shares their feelings about stress, anxiety, and poor sleep, it should be a major signal that the systems, if they're not already progressing to levels of seriousness, are at the very beginning, and it's a great time to start managing the underlying systems and the integrated component of those systems. So sleep disruption, sometimes we take that for granted, but we also know that sleep disruption is a result of increased cortisol that cannot be or is not being resolved and cycled through. Sleep disruption is a problem because we also now know that the immune system recharges itself, as does most of the body's systems, usually during our sleep cycles, and typically usually around that and between the hours of 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning. So if you're up between 2 and 4 o'clock in the morning, which is what a lot of people would report as sleep disruption, you can pretty much be sure that your immune systems and underlying systems are being compromised. So circadian rhythms are an important component of that, and we now know enough about the timing and the dynamic of the HPA axis as it affects these circadian rhythms to know what's happening, or maybe more appropriately said, what's not happening in our ability to be resilient. Why is that a problem? We know that with poor sleep, any one of the chronic disease states that are presented here in this slide have an increased risk of about anywhere from 30 to 50% higher rates of risk in the development of any one of these chronic disease states. So we know that sleep is quite important, and you'll note of all the chronic diseases that are listed here on the left side of the chart, we know that they all have one component in common, and that's they are all based in underlying inflammation. And so we know that, again, stress will increase inflammation, poor sleep will increase inflammation. As inflammation continues to be unresolved, then we also know that the progression and complications of these chronic diseases takes place. So what are the causes of sleep disorders? There is a genetic component to it. There are certain anatomical features that can complicate it. But most importantly, it's really related to two key issues: the extrinsic factors, poor lifestyle habits, the inability to manage stress, as an example, or the inability to be resilient in our moods. And then a variety of medical conditions and medications can also complicate just the external factors that some of our patients will be facing. So primarily what we're talking about today are these extrinsic factors and how they affect the underlying systems, particularly at the core of that, again, the HPA axis and a compromised adrenal function. Now, let's be sure that there are a couple of simple, if you will, starting points. Is that, as I mentioned, the CDC and the USDA announced at the beginning of this year, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of Americans are experiencing nutrient gaps and deficiencies. And why is that so important? Why am I even talking about that when we talk about adrenal function? Because the cofactors that are important in managing adrenal function and metabolic processes are based in our ability to consume adequate amounts of key micronutrients, in particular magnesium. And so we reported 40% of these individuals all have a deficiency in magnesium. And it's important, as we'll talk a little bit more later in this presentation, that these cofactors, these nutrient cofactors like magnesium, the B vitamins, vitamin C, play such an important role in stabilizing the system that that's really an easy starting point to make sure that your patients can begin to stabilize their systems. So the starting point is really improve the dietary practices and habits. But for some of your patients, they may have a more serious problem than eating better. And that's why taking a look at stress, the stress response, is really important. Now, several years ago, a company called Living Matrix, led by Dr. Priya Kamani, went through about 700 patient files across clinics in North America and tried to identify associations as for those patients reporting high levels of stress or high levels of sleep, what are the most typical clinical complications or problems that those patients experience? And so what she reported is presented here in this slide. And we can see here that obviously if your increased stress level, have increased stress levels, you'll have increased levels of anxiety, depression, but also there are a number of other co-health issues that occur at quite high levels when your patients are coming in. So the point of this is when a patient presents and they report high stress levels, start going through the therapeutic order and the functional medicine matrix and try to better understand a more complete picture of what your patients may be experiencing and even suffering through. So they may have migraines, they more than likely have some kind of a digestive complication or distress. They may be experiencing chronic pain and have a number of other associated issues. So again, the point of this is a systematic issue that we're trying to solve for, and a systematic underlying problem that needs to be taken care of that affect a number of different systems. We know that the common symptoms of stress are seen here. And so if a patient is coming to you and they're not necessarily saying, "Doctor, I'm stressed," look for some of these signs. Irritability and anger, fatigue or low energy is probably the most commonly reported presentation complaint by a patient, which automatically has been historically an easy way to identify adrenal dysfunction. But it's not necessarily the biggest and most common complaint. Where they're feeling sluggish, they may even report brain fog, ongoing chronic anxiety and nervousness, indigestion, muscle tension, and then a real telltale sign is if all of a sudden they've lost their appetite. Could also be another compounding variable. So look for, in patients that you may suspect high levels of stress, other symptoms that they may explain to confirm and validate the diagnosis. What about the impact of poor quality sleep? You might expect very similar components like anxiety and depression, and then a whole host of other issues. So this data that was presented by Living Matrix continues to be studied, and more data is being collated every year, all the time. But it should give us an idea of the incidence, the prevalence, and the corresponding clinical complications that we should be aware of. So again, it's not about managing stress. It's not about managing adrenal function. It's about managing the underlying system that's impacted by stress and poor quality sleep. So with that as background, and I think we all know what we see in our patient population, across the population, that stress and poor sleep are really no surprise anymore. It's such a high percentage of patients that are experiencing that. So let's talk about what can we do about it, and how does this work. So let's talk about the HPA axis and some of the key components that play an important role and can help us better understand how to manage this. So the most critical systems, as I've alluded to and mentioned so far, that when it comes to managing adrenal function, think about three major systems that need to be managed and addressed. It's the HPA axis, which is the network signaling and response. It's the neuroendocrine network that affects and influences two other major systems. Gut function and the metabolite influence on the neuroendocrine controls is important. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides. And probably I would suspect that even a more underappreciated system as relates to adrenal function is the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoid system, everybody thinks is, oh, it's CBD or hemp oil. But as I hope that I'll share with you in several more slides, what we'll learn is the endocannabinoid system is not necessarily dependent or require CBD or hemp oil, but there are other phytoactives that play a very important role, and probably a bigger role in being able to help manage this issue of adrenal function than people have been talking about. So these are the three major systems. When you think about adrenal function, think about, do I have in my arsenal, do I have a therapeutic program plan and a nutritional product or botanical product that I can use to help me manage all three? It's not a one and done, it's all three systems that have to come together. So let's start with the HPA axis. It's the central role in the stress response, yet it affects two other major systems. A normal and healthy response is designed to cycle through the stress response. So it's okay that cortisol goes up, but what's not okay is that if cortisol stays elevated for long periods of time. And so that's the first step, is trying to make sure that the adrenal system, the HPA axis, can recycle or recover itself, so you get a normal cycling in the cortisol response, and that the stress can be modulated and balanced. A resilient system and a network of influence and responses is critical to a positive lifestyle. And as we probably all realize, that cortisol can be the real core culprit in this thing that wreaks havoc to our digestive system, makes it harder to recover, and makes it more difficult to get good sleep. That's all controlled by the HPA axis and adrenal function. Some people like to refer to it as adrenal fatigue. Fatigue to me denotes that it's a tired organ. That's not really the case. The case is the functional response is not being resilient, and it's not cycling itself. So functionality or dysfunction is a more appropriate term when we talk about adrenal dysfunction and the management of stress and trying to improve sleep. So healthy adrenal function requires ongoing recovery, and it needs to be reset in between stress events for adequate resiliency to take place and to avoid the progression to and the complications of chronic disease states. If you have patients that are experiencing this issue, then at the end of the day, the concept is to allow it to reset, to allow the system to recover, and then for it to balance or rebalance itself for the long term. So chronic HPA dysregulation can be described by a couple of components, all influenced because the adrenal is not being able to cycle itself in the release of cortisol or the feedback loop to be able to reduce it. That affects the gut-brain network. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there's a neuroendocrine component that's really critical, and that needs to be addressed. The underlying systems metabolically need to also be addressed, and that's controlled by the endocannabinoid system and the receptors that we'll talk about, how those receptors are activated to enhance or recover a metabolic response so that the body can be resilient and can recover. tied to that closely is the resolution of inflammation, or the ability of the immune system to essentially respond to the initial insult, but then to recover itself. And that's also influenced by the HPA axis and by the metabolic and endocannabinoid systems. And then finally, with the success of working through those three issues, we now know that the stress levels, cortisol levels can be more appropriately cycled and managed and balanced, and that sleep can be improved, and sleep circadian rhythms can be more normalized. So here are the three models of what's actually going on. So there's a normal stress response. You know, it's the old fight or flight response that, you know, we all learn, but it's gotten a little bit out of hand, if you will. Physical stress, mental stress, oxidative stress because of bad nutrition are all common themes. But if the adrenal glands are normally functioning and there's a recycling of cortisol, it's really not a problem. What happens is if that adrenal response becomes uncontrollable and isn't cycling itself or being resilient, cortisols will stay elevated, and all the systems are negatively affected that we've been talking about. The immune system, the digestive system, the neuroendocrine system, the central nervous system network are all complicated. Now, chronic stress might be prolonged for some periods of time and can be managed, but in the worst cases, and in the worst presentation of your patients who have really chronic stress, they'll have high levels of anxiety, they'll have mood disturbances, and they'll have consistently poor sleep patterns. And so that just means that resiliency isn't taking place, and for sure the underlying systems are now so far advanced in complicated states that it's really very critical that a therapeutic plan be put together to solve this problem. So normally, as I've been talking about, normal is in the left part of this grid in the green, homeostasis. The body can get stressed out, it can respond. Stress out, be responsive. But with chronic stress, then what happens is the adrenal keeps putting out cortisol. The endocannabinoid system can't regulate its metabolic activation and response, and the gut is probably experiencing leaky gut because of high levels of cortisol, and there's the stress there, and there are metabolites there being created that make response even worse. So attempted adaptation sometimes help, but when patients report having chronic stress and anxiety, chronic anxiety and mood disturbances, it's time for serious functional or therapeutic order to kick into place. And that's why these are advanced formulations, and some of the key combination of ingredients that we're talking about today play such an important role in being able to effectively manage these three most important systems that we're talking about. So system number one is the HPA system. Stress elicits a release of prohormones or prehormones. The adrenal will then release cortisol. And the reason why we talk more and more these days about the gut-brain axis is because what happens in the gut is not only influenced from the central nervous system, but also, importantly, we now know the central nervous system is influenced by metabolites in the gut and then affects the brain. So about 80% of the central nervous system are efferent nervous endings that get to the gut, and about 15 to 20% of the nervous system going to the brain come from the gut. And those afferent systems are influenced by metabolites that are produced in the gut. And so if you've got dysbiosis happening in the gut, or you have leaky gut because of unresolved elevated cortisols, there are going to be a production of compounds that are going to stimulate the afferent nervous system that then sends signals to the brain, to the hypothalamus, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So we now know today that the gut-brain axis and the coordinated management of the gut with the HPA axis is very, very important, and more important than we had previously thought. So there's this neuroendocrine system, a neuroendocrine network, and a neuroimmune modulation that is very important in the management of today's patient. So cortisol is the culprit, as I've been talking about. There are the adrenergic nerves, the efferents that are going to the gut. And with elevated signals or overstimulation of a nervous system response, that's how leaky gut occurs. And so with leaky gut, we also know that that's further complicated if the metabolites that are being produced because of poor diet, that's not it, or because the wrong combination of a microbiome or microflora are not positive, the wrong type of intermediate metabolites are being produced that then stimulate the afferent nerves that then send the signal back to the HPA axis. And so it's critical that we not overlook the gut, especially in times where we're trying to address adrenal function. So as I've been talking about, the gut microbiome and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis are closely integrated, and they influence each other in both ways, from the brain to the gut and the gut back to the brain. It also plays a significant role in the changes in the production of hormones in the endocrine system in the gut that then leads to even more problems in the progression of chronic health issues. Another important component is the immune response, and we know that the immune system plays an important role not only in the gut. We all have heard many times 70% of the immune system in the gut, but we can't forget that the central nervous system and our nervous network is made up, 15% of that is made up of immune cells. And so if the central nervous system and the neuroendocrine response network is inflamed, and it will be in chronic stress and fatigue and with poor sleep, the central nervous system is inflamed and it needs to be resolved as well. And so it's not just about managing the immune response in the gut, it's about managing the immune response and the inflammatory response in the central nervous system. And that's why the neuroendocrine system, if it's compromised, will affect the HPA axis, and it becomes even harder for it to respond. So it's really critical, again, not to overlook the HPA axis and its nervous system network. None of this can be treated in isolation. Now let's move to the endocannabinoid system. So the endocannabinoid system, we've all learned a lot about that in probably the last 2 to 5 years. And we all think that it's CBD, and CBD is a cannabinoid, and it'll help with my mood. There's a bigger story and a more important story than that. And what we now know today is that the body is covered with very specific receptors that modulate the most important components of our body's response: metabolic processes, central nervous system response, and the immune system. And there are 2 types of receptors in the body. They're called CB1 and CB2. When it comes to the complete management of these underlying systems for stress, immune response, and metabolic systems, CB2 receptors are the most important. The body, by the way, produces its own levels of cannabinoids. That's why they're called endocannabinoids in the endocannabinoid system. And the precursor of the development of these cannabinoids are actually omega-3 fatty acids, and in particular, DHA. We also know that the activation of CB2 receptors is preferentially done by another class of cannabinoids, which are actually called phytoterpenes, or a compound that we now know that is found in a number of natural plants and botanicals called beta-caryophyllene. And so what's important is that CBD is not the single solution or the panacea that we all thought. There are actually other naturally occurring compounds that play an important role in managing the endocannabinoid system. We also know that there are other botanicals that play an important role. Omega-3 as a precursor. So if your patients are deficient in omega-3s, they're going to need omega-3 so they can make enough of their own body's cannabinoids. Boswellia is a very important botanical because what it does is it stops the accelerated breakdown of the circulating endocannabinoids in our body. And beta-caryophyllene, derived from natural botanical sources like copaiba oil, play an important role in being able to stimulate the CB2 receptors that helps recover the metabolic response and that helps to reset the inflammatory response in the central nervous system and in the immune inflammatory cascade. So the endocannabinoid system is not perhaps what many of us thought it is, but it plays a central role in a number of systems, including the one that we're talking about now, which is basically what causes and helps manage the stress and sleep cycle. So a little bit more on endocannabinoids and the importance to balance it. Stress is a stimulus for an increased need for endocannabinoids. And so with increasing stress, more endocannabinoids are produced and will be utilized to be able to activate the variety of metabolic systems, whether it's in the brain, the central nervous system, or in our physiological systems. So we have to make sure that we're providing the precursors for the production, the natural production of these endocannabinoids, and that we're also able to provide exogenous sources of terpenes or phytoterpenes that will help, like beta-caryophyllene, that'll help make the activation of these systems stay in order. And the combination of the use of boswellia will help maintain the viability of the circulating endocannabinoids and to make sure that there are enough circulating endocannabinoids to help the system recover and rebalance itself. So CB2 receptors are really important. And again, receptors are like doorbells, right? I mean, to get an activation or to get somebody to open a door when you're visiting somebody's house, you ring the doorbell, somebody opens the door usually they're friendly and they'll let you in. The body is made up of these doorbells or receptors. I like to make the analogy to is the CB2 receptors are found in immune cells, and they play a significant role in the body or the immune system's ability to resolve itself. And that's important because it works coinciding with omega-3 effect, with the effect of resolvins, and the effect of phytoterpenes. And so the endocannabinoid system is a very important role, and the solution is not what you may have thought before this presentation. It's not about CBD or hemp oil alone. It is about phytoterpenes and phytocannabinoids on a much broader scale. And so neural function can be improved, the immune system can be improved, and the metabolic system can all be improved with the right combination and with a systemic approach into being able to manage the stress response and a clinical regimen to try to improve sleep. So we've talked a little bit about the incidence and prevalence that we're seeing across the country and in our clinics on the incidence and what to look for, not only from a symptomatic point of view, but underlying symptoms of stress and poor sleep. I've talked to you a little bit about what the underlying systems are and why they're so important and how they can be influenced. And if they're not influenceable, how this chronic problem of stress and poor sleep will continue. But let's talk a little bit about some of the clinical insights and guidelines now in the time that we have left, and talk about when you have a patient that you're trying to better manage a combination of specific complaints of stress and poor sleep defined by adrenal dysfunction, what is it that we need to do? 3 objectives to manage. One is you want to make sure that the adrenal system and each of the most important systems that I've been describing can recover. They need to be allowed to recover so that a cyclic response to the stressors, for example, the release of cortisol, can be better managed and it can start cycling. It's resiliency. Number 2, you want to be able to put together a regimen that allows a system support for the healthy metabolic network of functional responses. And that simply means now you can reset the coordinated effect of the integrated system. So number 1, allow the systems to recover. Number 2, reset it so that it can work the way it's meant to. And then make sure that the full systems in a coordinated way are completely balanced and rebalanced and then functioning the way that they need to be, so that for the next occurrence of even a major stress response, it's not allowed to progress to mood disorders or even more complications like depression or confounded by poor sleep. So balancing the system for the long term is absolutely critical. So what are some of the critical ingredients, both nutrients and botanicals for recovery? Ashwagandha, magnesium, boswellia, of the three go-to ingredients to help reset the system and make sure that it's properly being able to respond. It's omega-3 DHA, a copaiba oil, also it's an excellent source of beta-caryophyllene or the phytoterpenes. These are the CB2 activators, echinacea, cordyceps, and licorice. And then for a balanced approach, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this presentation, what are the important nutrient cofactors? These are vitamin C, the B vitamins, and then adaptogens like eleuthero, rhodiola, and rehmannia play very important roles. So when we talk about the three systems, there are three stages in clinical care that we're trying to manage: recovery of the system, reset the system, and then keep the system in balance. So adaptogens and nervines are two important components. And if you've historically just been dependent on the use of either one of these, adaptogens or nervines, it'll be an incomplete process to trying to better manage the underlying system, because the adaptogens can help balance, but it won't help the recovery process, and it won't really help reset it, because it will have little to do with the cycling ability of cortisol and the complications that cortisol have overall. It may help the adrenal better respond, but it's not going to fix the system. So while the adaptogens and nervines play an important role, it's not the single solution to be able to help your patients get through these troubling issues. Again, taking into consideration the important role of the CB2 receptors and how those receptors are activated by phytoterpenes and the HPA axis is really critical. It plays an important role in being able to resolve inflammation, which can help relieve pain. It'll help reduce anxiety levels. It'll help lead to a calming and more relaxation feeling. And ultimately, all those improvements will help elicit a greater and more consistent quality of sleep. So this is another important system, and this is what you'll be able to do by managing an underlying system and a systematic approach of improvement. Now, there's been some data collected by investigators at North Carolina State University, and they have been able to show, to the point that I described before, hemp oil and CBD in particular stimulate or activate CB1 receptors, that you can see in the left-hand bars here. But in combinations of beta-caryophyllene and in combinations of botanicals like boswellia and copaiba in particular, we're able to reset the CB2 receptors and have a better balance. So what's really important is that if you're using hemp oil alone or CBD oil alone, you'll get a preferential stimulation or activation of CB1 receptors, and you may have what I would describe really short-term benefits in decreasing anxiety, but the underlying system still won't be addressed as completely as they need to. And so getting a better balance in combination of a CB1 with a CB2 activation response is really critical. So just as you think about managing the underlying and complete systems, we also want to make sure that we're providing a nutrient or botanical system that's as complete as the systems that we're trying to solve for. So what about clinical protocols? There are three ways that you could look at this as a clinical guideline. Number one is, are you managing the need for adrenal resiliency and complicated stress? Or are you managing individual components because perhaps adrenal resiliency is already in place, but the patient is having a harder time responding in a more positive way to increased stress? This clinical guideline, and there are three here that I'll share with you now, this clinical guideline identifies the most advanced issue that we've been talking about, and there's a series of decision trees here that this guideline presents. The number one issue is to try to identify what the fundamental issue is. Is it chronic cortisol increase? And you can address that by looking at diagnostic testing, talking to the patient, getting a patient profile, looking at to see if they have nutrition deficiencies, what their diet is, and how they would describe the functionality and the health of their gut and their digestive system. So there are different levels of approaches that you can take, and ultimately, each phase of care would take about a 3-week response, monitor the patient, and then if it's greater improvement is still desired, then you can add on to the therapeutic order-like method additional components. And so this is a clinical protocol that is available for the bigger problem, managing all three systems. We can talk about patients who have just a nutrient gap, have generally able to manage stress, but it happens frequently, or it happens for longer periods of time, yet it's not a chronic issue. And that may be a faster regimen, but it's the same decision tree of what's the first level of issue that they're complaining about that can be managed, followed by the second, followed by the third. So these are all a series of 3-week blocks of care leading to a total of 8 to 12 weeks where you should see significant improvement in following these regimens using some of the nutrients and targeting the systems and the issues that I've been talking about. And the last one is just restful sleep. And again, I would suggest too that in the spirit and in the understanding of underlying systems of approach, even for sleep management, it's not just about solving for sleep. That's a symptomatic approach. So for example, just providing melatonin to a patient who has consistent poor sleep and experiencing frequent bouts of stress, melatonin alone is not going to be enough. But melatonin in combination with, for example, magnesium or melatonin with an omega-3 will help address the underlying system in a more complete way. So there's no silver bullet, there's no single ingredient that can manage it because there's not one system or one issue that we're trying to fix in our patients. That's a symptomatic approach, by the way, but it's about an underlying system approach and a more complete way of managing patients as effectively as they need to be. So in summary, let me share with you some of the key points that we've been spending the last 45 minutes or so talking about. Chronic stress levels and loss of sleep will lead to consequences in compromised health status. More often than not, for the chronic patient with a patient with a chronic disease and chronic levels of stress, they have a dysfunctional adrenal system that's complicated with 3 major systems that need to be fixed. To address the systems, it's important to put together a therapeutic regimen that will allow the entire system, including the HPA axis and the adrenals, to recover, to let them reset themselves, and to balance and rebalance the entire system. Those 3 systems are the HPA axis and its broad network of influence, the gut-brain neuroendocrine system, and the endocannabinoid system of activation and balance. The most effective ways to do that from a nutrition and botanical combination are finding a complete and advanced nutritional supplement that uses ashwagandha and magnesium together for recovery, a combination of boswellia, copaiba oil, and sources of beta-caryophyllene to help reset and rebalance, the use of adaptogens and nervines to help balance and maintain and continue the balance of the entire system, and then the cofactors, usually as a result of nutrient deficiencies that primarily include the B vitamins and vitamin C. So with that, let me thank you for your attention. Thank you for the privilege of your time today. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to answer those that I might.
Great, thank you. That was a information-packed webinar, amazing. We've got a few questions coming through. I'm sure kind of as we talk to, a few more might come through. A couple with a lot of big words I'm probably going to struggle to pronounce, so bear with me, everyone. But one of the first one was, any tips for women who have sleep disruption issues staying asleep versus falling asleep during the luteal phase or weeks before their period?
Yeah, so those are increased times of stress. So what I think is possible is that, using particularly magnesium and ashwagandha itself will help the resiliency that's required during those times, and that'll allow it. And again, the luteal phase and in other phases, a chance for more complete sleep. So it's a matter of resetting cortisol and making sure that it recycles itself in a way, and that's a metabolic and a neuroendocrine network system that needs to be addressed. So So ashwagandha, magnesium, omega-3s, probably the best combination.
Okay, interesting. I believe you touched on melatonin, but there's a question, how does melatonin help with reset, rebalance, and recover?
Yeah, so melatonin, as it turns out, plays a significant role in the inflammatory process. And so melatonin does two things. One is it helps reset the circadian rhythms, and can help. We often forget, by the way, the HPA axis of the pineal gland. But melatonin is basically able to resolve the inflammatory response. And what's important is that it has twofold purpose. It helps to reset the circadian rhythms. It begins the process of resolving the inflammatory process, but it needs another component to help accelerate the resolution. And that's why combinations of melatonin with omega-3 are really important, or combinations of melatonin with phytoterpenes are also very important.
This is an interesting one that came through. How would you time nutrient support for night shift workers? Let's say a client works 12-hour night shifts 3 days a week. There was a couple questions on night shift or EMS workers who work through the night.
Yeah, I guess so. For the question, when you're talking about nighttime workers or 12-hour shifts, I'm guessing that you're talking about really that like the overnight shift. So they're working through what would be a normal night from 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. Right? Yeah. So that's always a complicated factor, and the problem with is night shift workers have to get into that rhythm where the circadian rhythms are then reset to the new phases that they're working under. And then it's complicated worse if they keep going back and forth from night shift to non-night shift working. So that's a complication in the process. So number one is always try to reset the circadian rhythm to the phases that you're working under, and try to maintain that as long as you can, even as uncomfortable as it may be socially, because you're off cycle with everybody else in the world. But you have to try to maintain that normal cycle as best you can, rather than try to reset it each week or each day.
Yeah, that would be a tough one to do those all night ones. I know, that's an interesting question. Actually too, is it fine to consider these botanicals for teenage and younger kids? And if so, what do you recommend dosage wise?
Yeah, I think for what we're describing, would really be for young adults, young adults and older, 18, 16 perhaps. For young kids, like 12 to 16, frankly, I think that there's probably some better regimens that would be more effective. Something like magnesium, exercise, yoga, practice of mindfulness, things like that, because they usually don't have the serious complications or progression into really chronic issues that we've been describing here with adrenal function.
Oh my gosh, there's so many coming through. This is great. Yes, for everyone asking, this is being recorded. You will have access to the recording shortly after the presentation, and it will live on YouTube, but also Fullscript's website at fullscript.com/webinars. Let's see, this one that just came in. What role or emphasis does elevated antioxidant intake via the diet show significance in assisting the management of body systems to mitigate negative elevated hormonal response? That's a good one. I can repeat.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's really a great question. So, the reason why antioxidants are so important is that oxidation in the body, and those processes of oxidation, if they're left unaddressed, they actually lead to immune modulation that leads to inflammation and hyperinflammation. And so that's why antioxidants, particularly in their ability to manage certain systems like the NRF2 system is important to be able to modulate that response so that oxidation doesn't continue. Because like anything else that we've been talking about even today is you can't allow a negative event in the underlying system to progress that causes a complication in the next system. And so that's really, really critical. So that has to be solved. So, you know, the antioxidants that we're all familiar with, particularly from fruits and vegetables and phytonutrients, are really important. Also, the ability to replenish the antioxidant system. You know, that's why things like NAC, glutathione, those are important components to be able to manage the oxidation process and the ability to have an antioxidant response, if you will.
Okay, this one is potentially a two-parter. Can we identify adrenal fatigue with specific labs via blood or urine? And how do we know which stage the patient is at in order to recommend appropriate supplements?
I'm sorry, you cut out just the first like 5 words.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first part is, can we identify adrenal fatigue with specific labs via the blood or urine?
Yeah, so this is really an area of ongoing work. And so, you know, the simplest test, although one of the more difficult to actually appropriately and accurately monitor, is basically levels of cortisol. So if you get the right protocol, you find the right lab, you know, able to measure cortisol, that's, you know, reliable test method. That's the first step. But we also now know that there are other tests that you can run to double check how far along this chronic stress state and adrenal dysfunction is. And so, for example, it is possible today to measure endocannabinoid levels. So it's possible to measure cannabidiols or terpenes in the bloodstream, and they're becoming to be important markers for inflammation and fatigue. We also know that if you look at omega-3 index, that's a pretty good indicator that if you're deficient or your omega index is really a low number, like below 6 for sure, but below 5, that's another good indication that you don't have the precursors to develop these intermediate metabolites that are important in being able to manage it. So those are 2 or 3 different diagnostics that could easily be done and started.
And then I don't know, or did you just touch on that? The second part of that question was, how do we know which stage the patient is at in order to recommend those appropriate supplements?
Yeah, that's a great part of the question is, you know, the best way to identify stage is just to talk to your patient and do a, you know, a historical perspective. Like, you know, if you use the functional medicine matrix or the therapeutic order naturopathic care, you'll get a pretty good idea on how long the patient has been experiencing this. And to be honest with you, if they've been experiencing elevated levels of stress, already have increased complications of comorbidities, they're in an advanced stage. So anything longer than 3 months is really advanced stage. Anything before that and episodical, you know, you can probably think of them as an early stage, and then use an appropriate, less robust therapeutic plan.
All right. Let's see what else. We have a couple questions on cortisol levels. One of them is, well, what are your recommendations for testing cortisol levels? And then, well, first I'll answer that one.
Yeah, you know, I have a bias on cortisol testing using serum or blood samples, and you know, there are a couple of labs that I think most of you are already familiar with. Genova as one example. Even you know, LabCorp does testing now of some of these markers. And there are a variety of lab companies that are very, very active in our fields that you can reach out to, and they've got protocols and methods ready to go.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll do one more. Actually, this one is kind of more general on your supplements or the ones you recommend. Would a patient or a client take all the supplements at the same time? Do you recommend throughout the day? Weekly, monthly?
Yeah, so the best way is an advanced formula that has all the nutrients that I listed, because they've been formulated for the synergistic effect. And as I mentioned before, right, is that you just can't manage a symptom. It's important to manage the underlying system. And if you just say gave ashwagandha, okay, well that's good to help lower cortisol levels, but it's not necessarily the solution that you need to balance or reset the other systems. And that's why you want to take them all together as an integrated total patient care approach. So look for advanced formulations that have the greatest number of the combined availability of the nutrients that I described will be the best way to do that. And basically, these patients should be taking these supplements for 12 weeks period of time, where you're also monitoring them on 3-week cycles. And even at the end of 12 weeks, it may be important for the at-risk, high-stress, exposed patient to be able to continue taking these products in combinations beyond 12 weeks.
And actually, to follow up on that, and I think I know the answer, but does Vital Nutrients have these advanced formulations available?
Yeah, so Vital Nutrients is introducing a complete advanced adrenal function product that'll be available in mid-November or so. And then in the meantime, the individual components we also have available in our product portfolio for the most part.
Awesome. All right, I know I'm conscious of everyone's time and of your time for being here too. We're at about the hour mark, so I just want to say if there's any more big questions coming through, you can email webinars@fullscript.com, and I can hopefully maybe connect with the Vital Nutrients team and see if we can get some answers through to you. But I want to thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Troup, and Vital Nutrients, of course. What a fantastic presentation, full of information, and I know lots of questions coming through, so people were loving it. So thank you again for being here. Hopefully we can do some more in the future.
Great, thanks everybody.
All right, and one more reminder, you will be getting a copy of the recording. You can go back and watch all the information again, and any resources we can provide will also include. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.